Let's learn the 13th Mishnah of Pirkei is attributed to Rabbi Shimon, who turns out to be Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel, and that's significant to understanding this Mishnah. It teaches us three things. Apparently the last of the three doesn't seem to be related, and the truth is there doesn't seem to be any major chidush innovation in what Rabbi Shimon is telling us until you realize who is speaking. Rabbi Shimon Omer, the Mishnah tells us, Rabbi Shimon says, you should be very cautious about saying Shema and about davening Shemona Esrei. Number one. Number two, when you do daven, al tas tefiloscha kavah. Don't make your davening by rote. Rather, you should be seeking compassion and beseeching Hashem. Number two. And number three, do not perceive yourself as a wicked individual. So daven fashtein, immediately there are three questions. Number one, do we really need to arrive at Pirkei Avos, which is supposed to be instructions about how you live beyond the requirement of strict Jewish law? And that's where we're going to decide, or that's when we're going to discover that we have to be careful about something which is mandated as a positive commandment in the Torah, or even if you want to argue that davening the Shemona Esrei is only rabbinic. So first of all, you don't expect Pirkei Avos to tell us to do a mitzvah mandated by the Torah. And these two mitzvahs specifically, Kriyas Shema and Tefillah, saying Shema and davening, V'zayin mitzvahs Yikriyas and Klolius in Avodas Hashem, they are fundamental core elements of how we serve Hashem. I'm going to wait to Pirkei Avos to tell me that I should be doing these things? That should be strict halacha. Question 2, base. Similar question to the second section of the Mishnah. When you do daven, don't do it as a fixture, but rather as a sentimental, emotive expression of connection to Hashem. What is this Mishnah telling us that we haven't already learned in a clear Mishnah in Masechta Brachos that says, any person who makes their davening just purely an item on in their diary, it's not considered supplication to Hashem. So we already know that you're not supposed to do this. What is Rabbi Shimon telling us? We don't already know. And then thirdly, Gimel, what is the link between the first two parts of the Mishnah and the third part of the Mishnah? Don't see yourself as a Rasha, that we shouldn't consider ourselves wicked. What's the problem with that? Because it will cause because the person who thinks they're a Rasha will say, well, I'm a lost cause, so why even bother trying? Why should I do tshuva? And the person will also be in such a defeatist position that they'll say, why even bother not doing anything wrong? I'm a Rasha already. So it's a good lesson, but what does it have to do to the Tzvei Friedekei Rois? What's the connection to the previous two statements, Wegen des Zehiris, in Kriyas Shema and Tefillah, which spoke about how careful you have to be in davening and specifically saying Shema. So apparently this Mishnah is telling us things we already know or we should have learned elsewhere, and it does not seem to have a theme that carries right through. Now, as is often the case, we need one point of realization to make everything make sense. So the Nekudas Habir in the Mishnah, the seed of the entire explanation is as follows. Die drei Heroes in the Mishnah sind verbunden damit, was der Baal HaMaimer, what's relevant to understanding these three lessons is knowing who said them, Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel. What's relevant about him is, by him is given Teirasei Nosei. Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel was one of those unique sages whose full-time occupation was learning Torah. Bedugma vi Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, quite similar to the very famous Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, Kidel Kamon Sif Ches, and we'll talk about that later in more detail. So knowing that the person speaking was full-time, 24/7, 365, engaged in learning Torah, gives us context that explains what his message is. Because in Devos Teirasum Nosei, somebody who is full-time invested in Torah is nit mafsik in limit Torah, it's a Kriyas, doesn't have to stop learning in order to say Shema. Why not? Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai says this as quoted in the Talmud Yerushalmi. He says, look at us as an example. We're completely involved in learning Torah. Therefore, we don't pause that learning even to say Shema. So Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel, who's speaking in our Mishnah, is technically exempt from saying Shema, and yet he's talking about the importance of Shema. That should catch our attention. If somebody is exempt from saying Shema, which is mandated by the Torah according to all opinions, he certainly is then exempt from saying the Shemona Esrei, which is maybe rabbinic according to some opinions. In fact, that is how it is written halachically. A person who is completely engaged with Torah learning is exempt from saying Shemona Esrei. Now that we have that context, now we know that the person speaking in this Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel, is somebody who did not pause his learning in order to say Shema or daven. So why is he speaking about how important it is to say Shema and daven? Because he dafka had the responsibility to ensure that his students, who would see how he behaved, not to say Shema and daven Shema Esrei every day, so he had to make sure he had the responsibility as such a teacher to ensure that his students would never be lackadaisical about davening, because they say, well, our teacher doesn't daven, so why should we? Therefore, he says, be very careful. You all need to be very careful about davening, and don't learn from me because I'm in a different experience and category than what you are. Then Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel talks to his colleagues who were also fully engaged 24/7 in Torah learning, and he says to them, seeing as they're completely engaged in Torah. Now, not in Zayin Darga, but they're not at Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel's level of complete engagement in Torah, because he's a unique individual, as we'll see later in the Sikha. On the Riber, darfen say, mafsik seine Krishma. Therefore, they actually do have to stop occasionally in order to say Shema, because they're not Torah samum nasum. They're not completely engaged in Torah learning. But Dugmet Sechavre Rashbi Kidder Kamon Sif Gimel, as we'll see a little bit later, that even Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's colleagues had to occasionally stop in order to learn Torah, in order to say Shema. So therefore he has to address them. Okay, so you have to say Shema sometimes. And when you do stop to daven or to say Shema, Al ta'as tfilos chokeva, don't daven as a matter of rote. You need to do it with heart and with passion. You're right that when you're learning, you don't have to stop in order to daven. You hear the words that he uses. When the occasion arises that you do in fact davening, Indeed, Zeiten, was es einen jem ispalel ki yadua, as dies was bazei is terosum nosum sein echem ispalel mizman, because we do know that even those great sages who were completely invested in Torah learning 24/7, they would also daven from time to time. So he warns them, you have to be sure that your davening is not functional. You shouldn't daven with the thought, when will I be free of this burden called davening? And don't daven thinking, I wish I could get back to the Sefer and continue to learn. You should daven with passion and beseeching and supplicating Hashem. So Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel speaks to his students and says, don't learn from me that you should never daven. You need to daven. And then he turns to his colleagues who would occasionally daven and said, don't do it just as the discharging of a responsibility. Invest yourself emotionally in your davening. By the Drita Hira, and a similar theme carries over into the third lesson of this mission of do not consider yourself wicked. Right towards the end of the Sikha, we'll see why that lesson is very specific to Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel, but we'll get there. Now, what have we explained? That Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel is talking to his students and saying, you need to be very careful about saying Shema and about davening, and not to use me as your excuse not to do so. So, you may have a question on it. The day of Rashbi, according to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel models himself on, his opinion is, as the Kirishma ein onu mafsikin, he says we don't take a break in order to say Shema. That opinion is Brengtzach Nor in Yerushalmi, only quoted in Talmud Yerushalmi. Aber l'das habavli, But if you look in the Talmud Bavli, which is how things are presented practically in halacha as well, then a person who is completely engaged in Torah learning 24/7, even at the level of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his colleagues, mafsikin l'krishma, they actually are supposed to stop to say Shema. So, why is Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel addressing his students that you should be careful about Shema, implying that he doesn't have to be, when in practice, he does have to be careful about Shema? Is the hasbara in them, so we'll explain it as follows. First of all, we know that even though there often appear to be contradictions or disagreements between the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli, we actually always look to consolidate them and to understand how they are in fact not in disagreement. Sometimes we'll even use a more difficult explanation as long as we can arrive at a sense of synthesis. So therefore it's mistaber to sagen, it's logical to say in our context, that there really is no debate between the Talmud Bavli and Yerushalmi, because it's actually an analysis of the different perspectives of how Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai saw things that you don't say Shema, as recorded in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and how the other sages who were also Torahsim Umnosam saw things that they did have to say Shema, as recorded in the Talmud Bavli. Why would there be those differences of opinions? Because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is a unique individual, and understanding his position will help us understand Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel's position. The time for was Rashbi halt, as mit nit mafsik seine Krishma. Why did Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai believe that you don't stop learning in order to say Shema? So he says a very logical explanation. Val zeh Talmud Torah shinen, v'zeh Krishma shinen. To learn Torah fulfills the mitzvah v'shinantim levonecha, to constantly learn Torah, and so does Shema. There's no logical reason to pause one way of learning Torah in order to accommodate another way of fulfilling the same concept to learn Torah. And with Yerushalmi's mamshich loit ein tiretz, in fact, Yerushalmi actually brings us from a certain perspective. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai al yedei sheyochodid b'divrei Torah. Another opinion says Tadir. Lefichach eina chaviv alav krishma yosem divrei Torah. Basically, the Gemara says over there, Talmud Yerushalmi, that because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was so sharp in his learning, or the other version, he was so consistent in his learning, so he didn't have that same value, so to speak, for the engagement of Shema, because he was doing this already, learning Torah. So in Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's world, he didn't need Kriya Shema in order to achieve what Kriya Shema achieves for pretty much everybody else, because he was fully engaged in Torah in an exquisite way. But Bizekem and Zogen, from which you can conclude that specifically Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai hat nit mafsik given the Krishma, only he did not stop his learning to say Shema. Okedia Kaloshin, as is expressed in that Gemara we've just quoted, Rashbi al yedei shaychod b'divrei Torah, specifically Rashbi, because he was so acerbic, he was so sharp in his Torah learning, in chaviva olav chule, for him Shema didn't have the same power. From which we can extrapolate that his colleagues did pause their learning in order to say Shema. Now, why is that relevant to us? Because when it comes to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai himself, we'll actually note that there's two different phases of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's experience. As es is by him given a chilek, there is given in me'ora. His behavior around davening/learning was different before he entered the cave for the 12 and then 13 years, und dem Zman nach seiner Reise, compared to how he behaved after having been in the cave. As das, was hat nicht mafsig given Kirschme, hat sich angegeben erst nach einer Reise from me'ora. When did Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai begin this practice where he would not stop his learning in order to say Shema? Only after he emerged from the cave and had elevated himself to this incredibly high spiritual level. When he really achieved the ultimate experience of learning and having that sharp insight into learning Torah, the Gemara detailt in Shabbos, as the Gemara Shabbos tells us in great detail. And that brings us to our Mishnah. As Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel is given bedugma to Rashbi. This is what's relevant to us. Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel was an individual who had attained that kind of Torah learning similar to what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai experienced after having been in that cave for 13 years. Whereas given Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel is similar to Rashbi after the cave. We'll talk about how and why that is a little later in the Sikha. But what's relevant to us is what's relevant to us is Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel did not stop his learning in order to say Shema, which is why he had to warn his students not to take his example and use it as an excuse not to daven, because they really needed to daven. So let's analyze this concept of Terasa Umnasoy and how it relates specifically to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai and Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel. So this concept, as by Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel is given Terasa Umnasoy Virashbi, the fact that we're suggesting that Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel was completely immersed in Torah learning to the extent that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was, and das ist die Nekuda hatichene von die drei heroes von the Mishnah, and that's relevant to us because it forms the pivot on which the entire Mishnah we've just studied is built. Is mirumas in them, it's actually alluded to. The fact that Rabbi Shimon ben Hasan, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai have this link is alluded to. By the fact that when the Mishnayos were collated, they did not say that this Mishnah is attributed to Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel, but rather they just said Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Hasan mitzayim full nomen kiragil. They didn't quote his name as is normally referred to. Now, blois Rabbi Shimon stam. The order of the Mishnah is specifically designed to refer to Rabbi Shimon, plain, without a father's name. Vastam Rabbi Shimon is got Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, which would have led us to imagine, normally when we see Rabbi Shimon, it's Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Now here it's not. The Mishnah is making a hyperlink. It's saying when you see that name Rabbi Shimon, you should be thinking along the lines of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, and that's going to be relevant to understanding the context of this Mishnah. Now you could say, but there's another good reason why we don't have to be told again that it's Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel in this Mishnah, because we just found that out a few Mishnayos ago. This Mishnah is a follow-on from earlier Mishnayos in the Perek, including where it says specifically die Chamisha Talmidim von Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai und zwischen sie Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel, that there were 5 outstanding students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, one of whom was Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel, so we know which Rabbi Shimon we're about to speak about. And especially on the Noch steht Heimam Rishloisha Devarim. The Mishnah specifies that each of these individuals taught 3 major principles. As jeder von sie hat gesagt 3 Sachen, right? Is doch me'elav movement as mit Rabbi Shimon Omer vet gemeint Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel. So we could work it out on our own that the Rabbi Shimon being referred to over here is Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel. Still, vebald aber as jede inyan in Torah is meduyek betachlis, seeing as every single thing in Torah is absolutely precise. Aber frat as die heroes von Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel seien in a besonder Mishnah. And especially when you consider that the instructions and teachings over here of Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel are in an independent Mishnah away from the one about Rabbi Yochanan and his 5 students. Kama Mishnah is weiter von dem Ort, wo sie meferish shmoi b'shem aviv. Quite a number of Mishnahs after his name and father's name had been shared with us, over Mele Gittas Amokim Latos, which could allow us to be confused. Which Rabbi Shimon are we referring to? I'm sure you've had that experience. Sometimes you forget. Maybe you don't learn the Mishnahs one at a time or all in the same sitting. So especially for them, was lernt bloß die Mishnah as the Balamaimis Rashi, especially if you had to learn this Mishnah in isolation, you could easily imagine that Rabbi Shimon over here actually is Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. That's not accidental. Is verstandig, everything in Torah is absolutely precise. That teaches us. As mitzadem tam pnimin deiros Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel is nagea. When you start to dig into the deeper meaning behind what Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel shares in this Mishnah, what's relevant to us is nit dos was there is Rabbi Shimon ben Hasanel. To understand the context, the most important information is not knowing which exactly Rabbi Shimon was he. Now, das was says Rabbi Shimon stam ein inyan mit Rashbi. What is very important for us is to know that this is a Rabbi Shimon personality, which is like the famous Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai personality. And once you understand what kind of a personality we're dealing with, it gives a whole different context to the Mishnah. So what kind of a personality are we dealing with? The explanation is this. The tam pnimi was stam Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Why do we normally assume that Rabbi Shimon, without any other description, is always Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai? Why? Weil the nomen Shimon is from Lashon Shemiah. Because as we well know, the name Shimon represents the concept of listening, and listening is not just with your ears, but it's listening and understanding deeply. True listening is to understand. When you have somebody who learns to the extent that they are totally immersed in their learning, that is their full-time occupation. Was der Id vereinzigt sich mit Torah, bis wird sein ganzer Umnus. That means that a person becomes one with the Torah. That is their craft, their greatness. So then, kommt dafka, wenn bei ihm ist der Askala verstanden Torah bishleimus. How does a person reach that point? Must be that they master the Torah that they are learning. Was demelt Werte vereinzigt mit Torah b'leshon Tanya, that causes that individual, as the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, to become completely one with Torah mit hayichud nifla shein yichud kamoyu, with an incredible union that does not exist in any other experience, where the person becomes absolutely one with the Torah from every angle and perspective. So who is Rabbi Shimon? Somebody who has become absolutely one with Torah. So therefore, anybody in the Mishnah who is named Shimon represents and exemplifies that principle. We know generally the names of Jewish people, especially names of very great Jewish people, represent and encapsulate their main theme of how they serve Hashem. It's no accident that a person is called Rabbi Shimon. That is how they serve Hashem. Any person, especially if they're in that caliber of the Tanoim, named Shimon, is an indicator that at some level they have the experience and the potential of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Torasum Nosai, completely one with Torah. Und therefore, is die Mishnah medayik zu sagen, da Rabbi Shimon Stam. That's why this Mishnah leaves out his father's name, Ben Nesanel, just as Rabbi Shimon, as das was Rabbi Shimon Ben Nesanel had gesagt, die Heirois, to teach us that what Rabbi Shimon Ben Nesanel shares, the three lessons of this Mishnah, is as mitzadem was in sich die Meile von Rabbi Shimon Stam, all reflect the fact that Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel had within himself the greatness of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Torah U'Mnosai, somebody who is totally bound with and one with Torah. So let's understand that principle of Torah U'Mnosai. What does it really mean, and what's the experience really like? The Geder von Torah U'Mnosai in Pashtus is, simply put, it means as das ha'inyan in Zman. Simply put, it looks like a time concept. That's the simplest way to understand it. Torah U'Mnosai, it's his full-time occupation, 24/7, without interruption. This is something that could also apply in the revealed parts of Torah. As I feel in Me'ora is Iske given in Torah Sameshnayis and not in Sefer Hazer V'Atikunim. Torah U'Mnosai means primarily focused on learning the exoteric, the accessible parts of Torah, the revealed parts of Torah, as we know that when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was in the cave, that's primarily what he focused on. Simple explanation. Steht aber in Zohar, but when you look in the Zohar, it teaches us mit Torah U'Mnosai meint men, when we say that somebody is a full-time Torah scholar, that is their occupation, what we actually mean is was lo zazas shchinta min hoin kol yamein. It's not just simply how much time they learn. It means Torah U'Mnosai means the Shekhinah, divine presence, never leaves them, never departs from them. Was der Fun ist verständig, that teaches us two very interesting perspectives. Number one, Aleph, der Iloi von Torah U'Mnosai besteht in der eiches dicke Zugebundenkeit zu Torah. Torah U'Mnosai is not a time-based measurement. It is a measurement of the quality and depth of connection that the individual has to the Torah that they learn. As ein ganzer Metzias is durchgenommen mit Torah. Torah U'Mnosai means the entire person is Torah. Literally, you cut them and Torah flows out instead of blood. Und kol inyone is not das, was is adira l'shchinta. And the Torah learning is not for the sake of knowledge and wisdom and accolades. It's purely to become a conduit for the divine presence. That's Torah U'Mnosai, first of all. Second of all, Beis, auch die Zugebundenkeit ist nicht nur zu Chochmas HaTorah, nur beiker zum Neusen HaTorah Shchinta. Very important, the connection and relationship that this person with Torah U'Mnosai has to Torah is not to the information of the Torah, but to the divine source of the Torah. It's a connection to Hashem rather than to Torah. So that's something which is very unique. You only get there through learning the pnimius, the esoteric, the secrets of Torah. As the Zohar says, only those who are masters of Kabbalah, of the mystical teachings of Torah, only they become a true conduit for the divine presence. So das ist echt die Geseit von dem, was Chassidus is mevoid, dem Inyan von Torah Nasai. That will help us to understand how Chassidus explains what is Torah Nasai. That it means, as the limit of Torah is an open from va'asim devarai beficha. It's a type of learning of Torah where the person completely loses all sense of self, and it's Hashem placing the information in their mouth. Meaning, that means that when this person learns Torah, you don't hear their voice. There's an immediate attribution that this is Hashem speaking via this particular teacher. Complete bittul, complete submission to Hashem. It's almost as if he's just simply repeating the words that Hashem is saying. So therefore, to reach that level where your learning of Torah is purely sharing Hashem's words, echoing Hashem's words, to reach that point, a person would require absolute bittul, complete submission to Hashem. To the point that the person is nothing other than a conduit for the divine presence. That's Torah Nasai, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and similarly Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel, individuals who completely lose themselves in the greater connection to Hashem and expressing Hashem's Torah into this world. That helps us to understand as the fact that we call Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai somebody whose primary occupation, his whole occupation was learning Torah, is as verbunden mit dem, was given von dem More Kabbalah. That is specifically linked to the fact that he is a master of mysticism. Is given der was hat mashpir given pnimis haTorah the under to know. Not only was he in his personal capacity a master of the mystical, he was the one who shared mysticism with all of his contemporaries. Was der Fahrer is given in the Dag of Chinalis and Torah Nasai Gufa, which would explain why he is the ultimate state of Torah Nasai, because that is completely linked to your connection to the esoteric part of Torah and your ability to have absolute bittul. This information, the complete bittul of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, explains why only he would not stop his learning for saying Krishma, as opposed to his colleagues who are also full-time learners. Because for a person to reach that point where their Torah learning is merely echoing Hashem's words in their mouth, they don't feel themselves at all. To reach that point, a person would have had to have absolute submission to Hashem. Absolute submission to Hashem. That's what Shema is all about. Complete sacrifice. Rashbi aber, when you're talking about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, especially after the transformative experience of having been in the cave for 13 years, was 24/7 in a position of total submission to Hashem. Not only when he said Shema. When we say Shema, we cover our eyes, symbolically saying, I give myself over to Hashem completely. It's as if I don't exist. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai experienced that for real. It wasn't just a statement. It was his real life experience every single day. He said about himself, I'm nothing more than a token of God in this world. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, I'm nothing. The only existence that I have is expressing godliness in this world. He was the ultimate conduit for the divine presence. That's why the description that's used in Zohar is, who is the countenance, the face, the image of Hashem in this world, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because he had disappeared completely from the picture. Und der Pfarrer hat nicht gedacht haben, die Akdome von Krishma, sein Nimm der Torah zu sein und Eifern von Torah zum Nosai. So he doesn't need the exercise of saying Shema to reach a sense of bittul so that you could have Torah Nasai. He's always there. So he didn't stop for Shema. Now, es wird erzählt in Gemara, fascinating Gemara Chagiga that tells us Ablozer ben Aroch hat gebeten Reshus beim Yochanan ben Zakkai, ibe zu sagen auf einem Dav echad shenimat toni. Very interesting story where Ablozer ben Aroch turns to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and he says, I would like to share with you something you taught me. And what is it? In Ma'aseh Merkava. Something of the deepest mystical concepts that could be taught, which the Gemara there says you're really not supposed to teach to pretty much anybody. As soon as Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, the Gemara says, started to share that particular teaching, the entire environment was suddenly alight with fire all around them. The trees were on fire. But the Gemara said, okay, so that's the story of Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. Then the Gemara goes on that it was Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel. Now these are colleagues of Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, also students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And what's relevant to us is one of the characters in the next part of the story is Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel, the author of our Mishnah. So they heard what happened with Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, that he was sharing these mystical teachings. So they also opened up a conversation about these deep, deep mystical teachings, and the fact that the Gemara says they opened the conversation is relevant. So so that those who report the story say it was midsummer. And the land literally rumbled, and they saw clouds and a rainbow. And there were all these divine announcements about what was being said and whether it should have been said. What do you see? What's fascinating about this story? As Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel is given from the Moreh Kabbalah. The first thing you see is Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel didn't just share a name with Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, but he's the same kind of an individual. Moreh Kabbalah, he is a master of the mystical, to the extent that not only can he share mystical secrets, but look at the impact that it has. When he shared words of that mystical side of Judaism, the earth felt it, and voices came from heaven. So in other words, he actually drew the divine presence down here into this world. Which tells us that Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel didn't only share a name with Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, but he lived the same life as Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, a constant conduit for the divine presence into this world. So therefore, we can understand that the teachings he shares in this Mishnah are relevant to an individual who is completely absorbed in Torah and has to warn his students not to do exactly as he does. Now we've actually listed 3 contemporaries, all of them Tanoim, all of them with access to Kabbalah. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, who we'll focus on, and Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel, who's the author of our Mishnah. Is da ein Ilin Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel, was der Pfarrer dafke bedugma zu Rabbi, wird angegriffen Shimon kenal Sivkim. Out of the 3 sages, Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel is the most mystical of the lot, the one who is Torah Nasa to the greatest extent, and therefore the one who shares the name with Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, as we already mentioned before, because that represents totally absorbing Torah in the highest possible way. So let's see. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch hat nor ibe gesagt an ihn, was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai hat ihm gelernt. Lim matoni. Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch, who was a tremendous scholar, in the story the Gemara shares about him, the mystical teachings he shared were not his own, it's what his own teacher had shared with him. He did not introduce any new insights. Whereas Rabbi Yossi HaKohen and Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel taught new information. Yet, zwischen Rabbi Yossi HaKohen und Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel, was sie haben Derisch gewähnt, meist am Erkav, in an Öfen von Poschu, bekeach atzma. But when it comes to the story of Rabbi Yossi HaKohen and Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel, it says they opened the conversation, which implies that they taught something new that hadn't been there before. But frat al pia, you're doing the period from Posach Rabbi Shimon v'chayotze bozeh, as das meint, as hat aufgeöffnet hat naim inyan v'tziner chulei. We know commonly that whenever we use the expression, they opened a conversation, actually means they opened a whole channel to a new dimension of learning that wasn't there previously. Still, is da ein Ilin Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel, if Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, there's still an advantage that Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel has over Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, in spite of the fact that they both innovated in mystical teachings. Because Rabbi Yossi HaKohen is all about being a Kohen, Kahuna. Die Zugegreitkeit, Leim der Schloss lifnei Hashem. To be a Kohen, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, means that you are somebody who has been chosen to always be ready to serve Hashem. Dat bekommt man doch berusha. That's something you don't do for yourself. You inherit it. You're born into the right family. You're a Kohen. So therefore, when Rabbi Yossi HaKohen opens a conversation about mysticism, it's not brand new because his entire being is dependent on others. A Kohen who's ready to serve Hashem inherits that position. He inherited the power to be able to share mysticism. The ultimate expression of being a conduit for the divine, as the ganze Metzius from mention is miyuchad mit Shchinta. In other words, the ultimate state where a person is nothing other than a conduit for the divine, is when the Merkava, that will reflect when the person opens a conversation about the deepest mystical secrets in an Eifenbos Peil Drasha Haaretz V'chole, to the extent that it changes the world, shakes the world, and kommt in Ganzen von sein eigenem Koyach, and it's something that the person worked to achieve of their own accord. It wasn't a hand-me-down from some great spiritual ancestor. Und das gefällt mir dafke bei Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel, was wird nicht angerufen HaKoyen. That is something that was unique to Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel. That's why he is not a Kohen. Is nicht gewesen a Kohen. Und von deswegen hat Pesach gewesen Ma'aseh Merkava B'ofen Hanal. And in spite of not having the turbo boost of great ancestors, look what he is able to introduce into the world. Not only a mystical teaching, but one that fundamentally impacts our world. So the Ili von Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel's Deris Ma'aseh Merkava for Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. If you want to really understand the greatness of what Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel achieved when he shared this mystical teaching, is most clearly illustrated that once he started to teach, not only Rosh Haaretz did the earth tremble, but suddenly there was a rainbow in the clouds. Rainbows are highly significant. Was das gewesen an Ness? Firstly, it's a miracle. Was is gewesen Kufas Tamas was anonim zanikin davar harogel. It's the middle of the summer. It's not a time you'd expect rain clouds, let alone a rainbow. But the truth is, a rainbow is not necessarily a positive thing. Why is there a rainbow when he's affecting such a powerful impact of spirituality on the world? The Gemara erzählt an Ilef Rabbi Shimon Levi as the Gemara, when it describes how great Rabbi Shimon Levi, says, how do you know he was so great? Nobody ever saw a rainbow as long as he was alive. Why is that a big deal? Because the rainbow is a sign of Hashem's promise never to destroy the world. And the Gemara says, if you have such a great, Rashi says, if you have such a great tzaddik alive, you don't need that reminder. So if the rainbow has this negative association, why is it such a big deal that Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel is teaching a piece of Kabbalah, and the next thing there is a rainbow? The explanation is fascinating. Because there are two elements of what a rainbow represents. Aleph, dos, and os, bris, shelo yoid mabul. Very famously, everybody knows it is a sign that there should never be another flood. In other words, you're in trouble, but don't worry, Hashem has promised never to destroy you. But beis, if keshes state as this is davashum mukoshli, the word keshes is actually used to explain that it is something that resembles or represents Hashem. Es ist zugeglichen geworden zum Eibishter. On the fares the din as also stakel bekeshes. That's why the Gemara tells us you're not allowed to stare or gaze at the rainbow because that would be disrespectful to Hashem. The rainbow is a representation of Hashem. You don't have the chutzpah, just sit there gazing. Beyond that, the third element about a rainbow is that we're taught in the deep mysticism of Torah, the Be'askinon, in the section, in fact, that Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel was darshaning about, as was Rabbi Yosef HaKohen, as was Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch. What does it say? There it says that the appearance of godliness is similar to the appearance of the rainbow in the clouds. So then is move on us, it's self-understood. Yes, normally when there's a rainbow, you think, oi, Hashem has to remind us he's not going to destroy us. But when Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel darshans in Ma'aseh Merkava, and then there's a rainbow, that rainbow is Kamari HaKeshes, Kein K'void Hashem. It is a representation of God. Der Stinyon von Keshes is no, wenn es kommt bei Medeiva. When is there the negative connotation of a rainbow? When it's a cloudy day. In Afab Volken Tatog. If it's an overcast day, it's an indication that there's some element of Hashem's strict judgment at play. But the clouds and the rainbow that appeared when Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel was teaching the secrets of Kabbalah, they were not there as a sign that, there's some kind of negative energy forming. We need to somehow weaken it or soften it. In this context, it's a sign of divine presence. That further helps us to appreciate that Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel is an individual who's completely wrapped up in one with Torah, and is an absolute conduit for divine presence in this world, and therefore he has to tell his students, don't behave like me. I can afford not to say Shema, because I've got this absolute dedication to Hashem. You need the Shema to help you achieve that bittul. So don't write it off, don't rush through it. One of the great things, the accolades that we give to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, so Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was the person who said, Yochel an ani lifter kol olam kulo min adin. I have the capacity to exempt the whole world from any judgment against them. Because we know that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's entire greatness was the fact that he was completely absorbed in Torah 24/7. Es ist verständlich, we can extrapolate, as das, was gekannt hatten, das Kolon und Kolon in Adin ist verbunden mit dem Minium von Torah und Nosei. Obviously then, the fact that he had the capacity to exempt the entire world from strict judgment must have been by virtue of the fact that he was completely absorbed in Torah all the time. Now, how does this work? The Rebbe explained in a Sikha, in the early Chalakim of Lekutei Sichos, what does Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai mean when he says, I could exempt everybody from Hashem's judgment? It doesn't mean that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai had the power to inspire everybody to do tshuva, and that would save them from negative fallout. Nor as sein schus is given as a gross. What he wanted to illustrate is that his personal merit was so overwhelmingly powerful as nit gucken dik auf der Avonos von dem Dor, that despite how bad the generation might have been, he could absorb all of their misdeeds, neutralize them, and exempt them all from punishment. Why? Because Torah Nosei. So therefore, by Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel is given the ilu von Torah Nosei bidugma to Rashbi Kenal. We have now identified that Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel had a similar experience of Torah Nosei to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So therefore, it's logical to understand is euch sein Auftan in Welt given al derech dem Inyan. Was Rashbi hat gesagt, he clearly had a similar impact to the world, or on the world, to what Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai had. I could exempt everybody from judgment. Verstandig, die Sheichos von der dritte Hira in the Mishnah. That helps us to understand why Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel, who is talking from the vantage point of Torah Nosei, has to include the third directive as well, which is Val Tirosh b'fnei atzmecha. Don't consider yourself a Rasha. And how that's connected to the previous two messages. Because the first two elements of the Mishnah help us to appreciate that Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel was a tzaddik at the level of Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, completely absorbed in Torah all the time, and therefore a conduit for divine presence, no person, no self, no ego, total submission to Hashem. Wie das wird ausgedrückt in die ersten zwei Reis in der Mishnah, as the first two elements of the Mishnah taught us. Was mit Tzadem is a meganev sein Torah and his seva kol avenuseim, and that gives him the ability to be able to protect his entire generation and absorb all of their negativity so that they don't feel the fallout. So therefore, in that context, the community needs to be warned, don't see yourself as a Rasha. What does that mean? Bichlal. Is Hazavas holtzich via Rasha. Generally, a person who perceives themselves as wicked, which would always be a defeatist attitude. I'm a lost case, so why should I do tshuva anyway? Is the anoga von yo and liudoi? So that person kind of suits what the Gemara says. Sometimes it's appropriate for the Jewish people to have some challenges in our lives. As we bring to mention Poronis v'Yisrim Rachmon Litzlan, but to brecht some mitzias and bring them to tshuva. Because when a person has those kind of pressures and difficulties and challenges in their lives, it humbles the person and forces the person to reflect on their life and do tshuva. But that didn't happen at the time of Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel. There were no difficulties or challenges to break the people in order to get them to do tshuva, because Rabbi Shimon ben Asanel was Torah Nosei, and he protected them. They wouldn't be punished and they wouldn't have to do tshuva. Not that they shouldn't do tshuva, they wouldn't have to do tshuva to avoid the difficulties. That's why Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel, who's protecting his generation, also has to guide them and say, the message is, don't think I'm going to do all the magic for you. Every person can do tshuva. Every person must do tshuva. And every person is guaranteed to do tshuva. As the pasuk says, nobody will ever be lost. And Rabbi Shimon ben Nesanel says you don't have to worry about going through difficulty. It is possible to do tshuva in a happy environment, in a tranquil environment, in a positive environment. And so, in fact, we should have the bracha of that tranquility and to do tshuva. And we should go immediately to greet Mashiach.